the national presentation of the results for the 2017-2018 Global Competitiveness Report. We're very pleased to have as our sponsor First Citizens, and without further ado, allow me to invite Mr. Larry Olton, Head Brand and Marketing at First Citizens, to deliver sponsor remarks.
Thank you very much, Nalini. Faculty members of Arthur Lockjaw Graduate School of Business, distinguished panelists, participants, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to extend to you all a very warm welcome on behalf of First Citizens and to say how excited we are to be the official sponsor of this year's national release of the World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Report 2017-2018 at this crucial juncture in our country's development. I am pleased to note that the event has grown since its first staging and has expanded in parallel with the work of the Lockjaw Graduate School of Business and through the support of each of you present here today. As you may know, the Global Competitiveness Report serves as a blueprint for many countries in formulating its developmental strategies. Trinidad and Tobago is no exception, as we find ourselves, perhaps more than ever before, in a position where we are in urgent and critical need of employing new and innovative ideas on how we restructure our economy for growth going forward. This report ranks economies based on the Global Competitiveness Index, which measures the micro and macroeconomic pillars that determine national competitiveness and, by extension, national productivity and output. As inputs for the Global Competitiveness Index, the World Economic Forum uses both publicly available and privately gathered data in the form of the Executive Opinion Survey. This is a comprehensive survey conducted annually by the World Economic Forum and its partner institutes. So it is a robust and reliable gauge of competitiveness. TNT dropped 94 out of 38 to 94 out of 138 countries in the 2016-2017 report, down a full 10 places from our position in 2012-2013. Our Caribbean neighbors, Jamaica and Barbados, placed higher than TNT at positions 75 and 72, respectively. Today's forum has cemented itself as a credible mechanism through public and private sector partnerships, and it is our expectation that the panel discussion that follows the presentation of the report will serve to continue to build on the ideas and imperatives necessary to help us to turn the tide. In the last year, the importance of resilience built on competitiveness through a diversified economy has been very clear once again, as lower commodity prices cause challenges for economies like ours. The index allows us to look beyond the headlines that dwell on the overall ranking and instead drill down into the detail. Where are there improvements needed? Where exactly should further investments be made? How does this information drive public policy? By using the index in this way, we hopefully stand a better chance at fueling recovery. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, stakeholder engagement and information dissemination continues to be very important to the success of Trinidad and Tobago's development. We at First Citizens see ourselves as a catalyst and equal partner towards the further advancement of our country. We also recognize the importance of each sector as contributors to the national economy and as part of the solution. We look forward to hearing meaningful discussion filled with key recommendations pertaining to additional steps to consider in order to develop our business environment. In closing, I want to thank you for your support of this initiative, and I trust that today's discussions and deliberations will lay the foundation for productive collaborations going forward. Thank you.
Courses in Caribbean and International Business Management, Financial Management and Accounting in International Masters of Business Administration, the IMBA program. He's also the program director for the Master of Small and Medium Enterprise program. Put your hands together for Dr. Kisto.
Thank you, Nirmala. Thank you, Mr. Olton from First Citizens Bank, Dr. Terence Farrell, Chairman of the Economic Development Board, Mr. Ian Chinapu, Executive Director of the Unit Trust Corporation, Ms. Vangji Bagu Ramratan, also from First Citizen, our special guest from Norway, Mrs. Stelomak, who is here, other specially invited guests, members of faculty, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my pleasure once again to be here to present this all-important Global Competitiveness Report, which is being launched simultaneously across 138 countries across the world this morning. This is the official release of this report across the globe. So my presentation would be in three main areas this morning. So first, I would explain the index a bit for those of us who might be new to it. For those of you who know it, bear with me. I would then take a global perspective on the index, and then we would look at it from a local and somewhat regional perspective, which would then lead us into our panel discussion. So, as we know, the report is produced by the World Economic Forum, which is out of Lausanne in Switzerland, and this is their flagship report. Every year, they collect data and they produce a number of different indices. They have the Travel and Tourism Index, they have the Gender Gap Index, and they also do the Technology, Information Technology Index. But this is the flagship report, is the first one that usually would come out during the year. And it is based on what we call the Global Competitiveness Index, and I would explain that to you a little more as we go along. But basically it captures information at the macro and the micro levels of competitiveness and what determines how competitive we are. Bear in mind, competitiveness is the end product or the end result. So it would look at basically factors that enable an economy to achieve long-term sustained economic growth and prosperity. So for that reason, we say it's a lead index. It doesn't take into consideration only what happened in the past, but it sort of tells you, what is going to happen in the future based on the information that is collected. And it is intended to do things like this, to have discussions and to, how shall we go forward? What are some of the policy changes and so on that we are looking to make or should be making? Based on that, the index defines competitiveness as a set of institutions, factors, policies, and factors that determine the long-term or the level of productivity of a country. So there are some key terms there highlighted: institutions, policies, factors, and productivity. Because the base of competitiveness is our level of productivity. Because the level of productivity is what would set the long-term growth and prosperity of a country. The more productive you are, the more you're able to produce, the more efficient your economy would be, the more prosperous you are in the long run. So basically, we're looking to be how productive and where can we make changes to improve our level of productivity. What is the implied framework? So it's built on the framework that in any economy, it is firms that forms the productive units. And so the work of government generally is to ensure that there is what we call the enabling environment. Those raw conditions that would make for trade and investment and more or less national competitiveness. So government is seen as an enabler. In short, how do we fix the base? How do we get the soil right so that we are able to thrive and grow? Now, why do we need to measure competitiveness? So this year, two important pieces of statistics came out of the report and to why this is important. One was that a report that was done earlier, which was called the Social Inclusiveness Index. And what I saw was that countries that are more competitive also had a greater level of social inclusiveness. So they ensured competitiveness was required for economic and social progress. If you were more competitive, you are more likely to have inclusive growth. Secondly, countries that were more competitive tend to grow faster. And as you can see from this graph here, these are the more competitive as opposed to less competitive economies. The more competitive you are, the faster you were able to grow. Now, let's speak a little bit more about the composition of the index and what is made up and so on. So the Global Competitiveness Index comprises of 3 sub-indices made up of 12 pillars. So if we look here, we see we have the basic requirement sub-index, the efficiency enhancer sub-index, and the innovation and sophistication sub-index. And so the 12 pillars of competitiveness are broken up and would fall under each of these 3 sub-indices. Now, you will see here factor-driven economies, efficiency-driven economies, and innovation-driven economies. Basically, what we are saying there is that the different pillars would have a different weighting depending on the stage of development that a country is at present. So if you are in the efficiency-driven stage, then efficiency enhancers is seen as having a greater weight or more important towards the overall progress and development. If you're in the high-income, innovation-driven stage, then you should be paying attention to your innovation and business sophistication factors. Now, what would determine where you fall? It is largely determined by your level of per capita income. Now, I want you to remember this figure. Along the way, I'll be asking you to remember certain factors because we will be referring to it as we go further. This figure here, key, $17,000 US per capita income. So once you fall above 17,000 per capita US dollars per capita, you are classified as being an innovation-driven economy. Yeah? If you are between 9 and 17, you are considered to be in a state of transition. And so the weights would differ because of that. Now, where do we get the data? As we said earlier, there are 2 main sources by which the data would come for this index. There's a comprehensive survey that is administered between the months of February and April of every year. And as the partner institute of the World Economic Forum, the Lockjack School of Business has the responsibility of administering that survey. And I can tell you this year, the WEF instituted greater stringency in how they collect this data. It was not a big change for us because we always maintained our data integrity and so on, but it became even more stringent into how they surveyed, ensuring the reliability and rigor of the instrument, who did it, and so on. And the reason for that is they can have greater control over it now because previously we did online as well as paper surveys. Now everything is done totally online. So we have greater control. We no longer have to get FedEx to send up the paper surveys and so on. Also, of the 114 indicators that would make up the index, at least 33 of those dimensions or indicators are determined by hard data. So that's where they want the quantitative data would come in. And those data, they are sourced from internationally recognized institutions, or in some cases, they would ask us to, where they didn't get some data, they would ask the school to provide or to help get that data from national sources. But they would usually go to places like the International Trade Organization, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, to obtain that hard data. And that is important. Why that's important? Because if your data is not updated at those sources, then you don't have the true reflection of the state of those indicators. Yeah? Now, what the results would show? We are looking for three main things. Our rank, our place in class. Our score, what is the marks we got? Now you'll see that they have a score will be between 1 and 7. And that 1 and 7, that like a scale, is because the survey that is used would rate or would have a score between 1 and 7. So that is reflected in the overall score that is given for any country. So you'll see a score of 1 and 7, and then question 5.1 of the survey would speak to the problematic factors for doing business in a country. Now, they may sound separate, but we'll see that there are linkages between these three things: the rank, the score, and the problematic factors for doing business in a country. So what are some of the highlights of this year's report? Well, on a global scale, in terms of the ranking, there were small changes at the top. We see Switzerland still at number 1. A small but significant change there. The US is now at number 2. Now, for quite some time, the US dominated this. The US was at number 1. Let's say in the last 8 to 10 years, the US has fallen, and it went as far as number 5, I think number 5 or number 7, and we have seen the US now actually taking over second place from Singapore in this year's survey. Of interest, Mr. Stelamak, Norway is at position number 11 with a score of 5.4. Now notice the scores between the first place to position number 28 is a 0.8 difference in scores. 5.0 to 5.9, 0.9 difference in score, which means that it's very sensitive. The scoring is very sensitive. Now, two key insights that came out of the survey this year. One is that 10 years after the financial crisis, we still see that financial institutions are in a vulnerable position still. But I must point out, if you look at the graph here and you see Latin America and the Caribbean, financial institutions have stayed fairly constant across the period of time. And even at this one, Latin America and the Caribbean, we have stayed. So which speaks to the management of our financial sector here in the region. Second, and very important and key insight that came out of this year's report was that there was no need to trade off between labor market flexibility and workers' rights. What did that mean? Countries that offered greater protection, greater worker rights, flexibility in work, and so on, proved to be the more competitive economies. Or we can see it differently. The more competitive economies were the ones that had greater worker protection. And that is significant. The old adage held true. The more satisfied your worker, the more productive they would be. And the more productive your worker, the more productive a country would be, and the more competitive that country would be. Okay, so let's bring it home now. Let's look at Trinidad and Tobago, and then we'll take it regional. So, Trinidad and Tobago, as you would know from your package, and the base data here. Now, if we look, and let's take this graph, this slide from the bottom up. 2014, per capita GDP, 21.3. 2015, 18.5. 2017, 15.342. small bit of mathematics, between 2014 and 2017, we lost approximately 6,000 US per capita income. Of significance also, we crossed that $17,000 threshold. Remember, I asked you to remember that 17,000 US threshold, which meant that we are no longer classified or seen as being in stage 3 of development, but we are now seen as being an economy in transition from stage 2 to stage 3. The impact of that was that the weights of the index is a weighted index. So weights shifted slightly away from the innovation index. So last year, the weight there was 30. This year, it's 25.9. And for basic requirements, it went up a bit to 24.1. So we saw, because of that reclassification, there was a change in the weights. Now, if we look at our ranking now, we saw that from last year to this year, we moved up 11 spaces, which is good. Any movement up and a score increase is a movement in the right direction. I will go on to disaggregate that. Now, I want you to also notice the year 2012-2013. We were ranked at 84, and then after 92. This was the last year that we were classified as economy in transition. The other years we were in a state, because of our per capita income, we were classified as being an innovation-driven economy. And again, as I said, innovation-driven means to say that at a per capita income of that level, if you have to maintain your long-term growth and prosperity, you must invest in innovation and business sophistication. So we are now at 83 with a score of 4.1. Now, let's take a look, a slightly different look of the pillars. So this is the web of the scores on all the pillars. So basically what we did here was to use the scores of each of the pillars and put it in the form of a web. Right? So this is the web, and it's compared to countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the blue would refer to Trinidad and Tobago, and the shaded area would be Latin America and the Caribbean. So you can see that we are doing better in 10 of the 12 pillars when compared in the region. Market size, because of our small population, would always be an issue for us, but macroeconomic pillar, which traditionally was one of our strengths, we were actually as high as 6 out of 7 in macroeconomic pillar. We have now fallen considerably in that area. Now, you know, in the Sunday or the Express or any newspaper, in the comic section, they will show you 2 pictures and ask you to find the difference. I want you to do something here similarly for me. So this is the web for the last 3 years. I want you to focus on this year here and this year here. What is the significant change that we have seen in the last 2 years? It's basically where? In one pillar, pillar 5. And I would double click on that in a while. Higher education and training. Except for that, you'll realize that we more or less stay the same. Yeah? And just to frighten you a little bit more, I decided to put that in figures. You can see that. But what I want you to look at here is that on higher education and training, our ranking went from position number 74 to position number 33. And the score moved from 4.3 to 5.1. It's the most significant movement in the index. And I'll explain why that is so in a while. Now, so let me disaggregate now how we moved from 94 to 83. We started at 94 because of the change in the weights. Remember I said as we move from innovation to economy in transition, the weights would change slightly. Now, because we are relatively better off in the basic requirement pillars than in the innovation and sophistication factor pillars, and the weights move towards that, because of that, it accounted for a change in 5 spaces. So we went, but for that alone, we would have gone to position 89. However, because of our increased score in the higher education and training pillar, it took us up 6 further spots to position 83 and give us a score of 4.09, 4.1, basically. Let's double click into some of those, especially that one, higher education and training. And again, let's compare last year to this year. You will notice one of the indicators changed, which accounted for the increase. And that one is this here. Tertiary education enrollment rate. And you may ask, so why is this 12% all these years and it is now 65.5? And the simple reason for that, in 2 words, data inertia. It has now been told to the world, at least to the World Economic Forum, that Trinidad and Tobago have a program called GATE, and because of that, our tertiary level enrollment is now 65.5%. Reason for that, not having a proper functioning national statistical body in the country. Our data has not been updated at the internationally recognized sources for the last 10 years for this. It's only this year, WEF asked us, the school, seeing that the data was grossly outdated and knowing otherwise. And so we were able to work with the Ministry of Education to source that data and provide that data to the WEF. And because of that change, it accounted for a 6th-place improvement in our ranking. So in short, we could have been there at least 5 years ago when our tertiary education ranking improved. Yeah. Let's look at macroeconomic. Now, if you look at the macroeconomic pillar, it is not directly, you can say, have to do with the economic performance per se of the sectors in the economy, but the economic management of the country. So if you look at the indicators there, we look at deficit, national savings rate, government debt, and so on. And basically, these are the factors that we look at to determine how well we are doing at the macroeconomic level. Institutions. I always highlight this because it is ground zero for competitiveness. You have to have your institutions working if you are to get things done. Remember the definitions? Institutions, policies, and factors. Institutions are the ones who would carry out and institute the policies, who would execute policies. And so you have to have your machinery working if you have to get the end result, which is competitiveness. And you notice, as a scorecard, this is the ones that we have the most amount of centuries. And innovation and sophistication. I'm just going to look at the innovation pillar. Again, we are struggling a bit with innovation, and it's something I think we need to look at. We need to discuss how we can get that up, how we can have a more innovative society, a more innovative economy. We are said to be creative. How do we change that creativity to innovation? And thirdly, the problematic factors for doing business in a country. So, generally speaking, this has not changed from last year to this year. We still see poor work ethic of the national labor force. Of course, I must put an asterisk to say that could be because of the sample because remember, it's executive and business people and so on who will be filling this out. So, I would put a caveat there as that. Inefficient government bureaucracy, corruption, and for the first time, I would say in the last 12 to 15 years, we have seen a new problematic factor. In the last 12 to 15 years, the top four had not changed. This year, we are seeing foreign currency regulations being one of the top problematic factors, and that should be no surprise given our situation in the foreign currency market. Now, small comparison in the Caribbean. It so happened that the only country in the region that took part in the survey this year was Jamaica, Barbados, and Guyana and Suriname, was usually part of the survey, did not participate, or was not, I shouldn't say didn't participate, was not included, and I'm quoting here from the report, because of insufficient data. So the only two countries in the region was Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. And you can see there that Jamaica is ranked now at position number 70. Now, notice there, Jamaica started at 97 when we were 84, and they had had a steady progression to position number 70, whereas we were a bit fluctuating. But interesting is, let's look at the web here as compared to Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica. Two things of significance there. One, Jamaica's score for institution is higher than our score for institution. It's about 0.5 or 0.6, but it's significant. But their score for the working of their institution. But secondly, and more significantly, is that because all the other factors you realize were more or less the same, except for goods market efficiency, labor market efficiency, and financial market development. In short, what we have seen is that a better performance in the pillar of institutions have led to more or efficient and better performance in labor market and goods market efficiency. And that, in essence, is where Jamaica has been performing better than us in terms of this index. If you compare the problematic factors, and you can see the link there also, the problematic factors for Jamaica, their big problem they see is crime and theft. What we have in common between Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago? Corruption has been seen as a problem. But notice that efficiency in government bureaucracy was at number 5, whereas it's number 2 for us. Again, a reflection of the operation of institutions. Okay? So, in closing, and this would now take us into the panel discussion. In order for us to tackle any of the fundamental problems that we have in the economy, and we think diversification, foreign exchange, social inclusion, you name it, we need to have an enabling environment. Competitiveness is the end product. How we get there, the process by which we get there, is what we need to look at. We need to have a system that works. To get anything done, we need to have a system that works. And so the discussion that we need to have is, how do we enhance our competitiveness? How do we get things working? So with those few words, let me thank you for your attention and hope that we continue in the direction of our upward movement. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gisto. At this point in time, as our moderator this morning, and we're very pleased to have Dr. Terence Farrell, who has served on several government-appointed committees addressing various public policy issues. He is currently the chairman of the Economic Development and Advisory Board. Let's give him a round of applause. Mr. Ian Chinipu is currently the Executive Director of the Unit Trust Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago, and he has more than 21 years in banking and finance throughout the Caribbean and Central American region. He's a long-standing adjunct faculty here at Lockjack GSP. Ian. Ms. Vangi Bagu Ratan is currently responsible for the operations of the First Citizens Research and Analytics Department. She holds over 13 years of experience in the financial sector. Ms. Ratan. Ms. Guru Settlemark is Secretary General in Transparency International Norway since 2009. By profession, she's a lawyer and has for many years worked as a senior legal advisor at the Norwegian Data Protection Authorities in Norway. She has also served as political advisor for the former Minister of Justice. As they settle in, I just wish to let you know that should you have a question, you can simply raise your hand and the microphones will be passed to you, and the presentation this morning by Dr. Kisto will be emailed to you. And if you wish to have Dr. Kisto make this presentation within your organization or for your teams, for your different departments, certainly let us know. We'll be happy to have him come to you. So, Dr. Kisto, it's in your hands.
Thank you, Nirmala. And let me thank members of the panel here, this distinguished panel who take time out from their busy schedule. And now it's the end of the financial year. And there's also and these are people who are the forefront of the economy and getting things working. So, let me start off with Dr. Farrell. I know this is not new to you. You have been here before. You have been following this. What would you say, looking at this year's index, what would you say stood out to you?
Well, I think the mistake, and that is that the fact that one of the things that we've been saying for many, many years is that our data, the Central Statistical Office, the production of data in this country is really in very bad shape. It's been in bad shape now for going on, I would say quite frankly, 25 years. The fact that we were not able to input into the index the data on tertiary education enrollment, I think is simply a serious indictment, not on the institutions that collect the data, but on us, that we have a CSO that has simply degenerated to the point where you have really seriously missing data, really seriously flawed data, as in labor market data, the unemployment rate, and so on. Even let me just point out, even our GDP numbers that the CSO produces are not right. And I would say that categorically. You can't produce real GDP numbers as we are doing, constant price numbers with a 2000 base year. The base year is 17 years old. And so the numbers are simply not trustworthy, I think, in any aspect of our national life, except perhaps for the murder rate.
Yeah, and I didn't say that when I was presenting, but let me tell you, this is not a problem we have been dealing with now. For years, we have been pointing out and telling the WEF, we know that our data is outdated. And the WEF will keep telling us, if you want us to pick up those data, update it at the international sites, because we take the data there for transparency, objectivity, and so on, for all countries there. And it's only after years of saying, hey, we need to get some of these. Finally, they say, okay, we will take some statistics that we find missing or really outdated from you. But this is an exception because the onus is on us to get this out there. This is, I think, is about the 6th year running that I've been making the same point in terms of data and updating the data. And I actually proved this year because a few years ago, and I've done this to more than one different ministers, who said, I'm going to fix it next year. To the point now where some of them, they don't show up because it has not been fixed. So data is a serious problem, and we can see it can take us up. And this is not only this index, but a number of different indices. Now, let me go to Mr. Chinapu.
Morning.
We now see a problematic factor with the state of foreign country availability. To what extent do you see that as being a factor affecting our competitiveness? And how do we deal with this in the long and the short term?
Well, I'll take the first part.
Yeah.
I'll leave the how do we deal with this, my second comment. Yes, of course, it is a major factor because with globalization, we're part of a global economy, and our currency is a soft currency, which means it's not accepted outside of our country. So, quite frankly, we must interface with the world through a hard currency. And of course, the global reserve currency is the US dollar. But any of the hard currencies would, I think, any business person would accept at this point. But essentially, not being able to speak the language of trade at this time is how I would categorize the foreign exchange problem. So it's more than a foreign exchange issue. It's the inability to conduct business in a manner that's timely and efficient because of the access to foreign exchange. That said, I think most of us would believe or understand that the foreign exchange problem we're having is not just a problem of our export earnings. It's, and I would say categorically, the macroeconomic environment factor that you presented, Balraj, is very clear. We are in a depressed state for our commodities. Won't get into the comment of, knowing that diversification is something that we should have probably focused on a bit more, a lot sooner. But that said, where we are is in a state of depressed global commodities. However, our culture of spending is now being put into the spotlight because let's assume the country was an individual. If an individual's income is falling, you naturally have to relook at your spending. Very good. You're with me, and that's good. I believe that our problem, therefore, with regards to the spending side of things is cultural, and it's really an issue at the individual level because I believe that in our culture, people recognize the fact that we have to adjust our spending and our import habits. We just believe that everybody else should do it. Yeah. Not me, because I have to have the stuff I'm accustomed to having. So we've gotten into that culture of spending, and the commodity pressures that have caused revenues to fall, and therefore our income to fall, has not yet translated into that sustainable, definitive, focused effort on managing not just government spending I'm talking about here, this is consumer spending. And that has to be the first effort that we all make as a society. Again, yes, the government is part of society, business is part of society, but everyone has to make that determination as to what are our true priorities when it comes to spending, and then it will filter into foreign exchange savings. So at that point, we have to balance our books and then move from there. That's my view on the second part of the question.
Yeah. So, Rangi, taken up on that, when we consider that our food import bill is close to $12 or $13 billion, our productive capacity here is low. How do we cut that spending, and what do we do to prevent that or help that? How how do we take that up?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with one of the pillars that was mentioned in the report, and that's innovation and building a culture of innovation in Trinidad. That was one of our lowest scores actually in the index. And by creating and instilling a culture of innovation from the university level at least, you will find that level of research and development to get into productive sectors other than, and it all ties in with the whole diversification trust and get into sectors that will be able to produce for you and earn foreign exchange, valuable foreign exchange dollars at this point. But that, of course, is a long-term sort of objective.
Okay. So, Dr. Farrell, and I know this is something that you all at the Economic Development Board have been looking at. How do we jumpstart that part of the economy, that innovation? How do
Well, before I talk about innovation, I just want to disagree slightly with Ian. I mean, that foreign exchange availability issue is an entirely self-inflicted wound.
That's correct.
There is absolutely no reason why we should have had that score there. We have done that to ourselves. What the government has implemented, I'm saying the government as distinct from the central bank, has implemented in the last 2 years has caused that problem. The government has caused the problem with the foreign exchange availability. Ian is right. Commodity prices have fallen, oil and gas prices have fallen, which means that immediately our income terms of trade have declined. Our income has declined, and therefore you have to adjust. How do you adjust? The government has to cut expenditure, the private sector has to cut expenditure. How do you induce people to do that? People behave in a rational fashion. So if nothing changes in their objective environment, their behaviors are not going to change. And therefore, one of the things that the government needed to do in order to conserve foreign exchange and to reduce the demand for foreign exchange was to have moved the exchange rate. It refused to do that. And as a result of that, it went into a kind of a pseudo-exchange control kind of situation, which has caused business people to be affected adversely by that and cause that score. The second problem is the inefficiency in the public service. The inefficiency in the public service, which has been on our score here for years, is a huge problem. It is a major problem in this country. And I'm saying that simply because in the last couple of years since I've been involved in the Economic Development Advisory Board, I have had to be dealing with the Trinidad and Tobago public service, and it is a nightmare. and I say that, I mean, well, it is an absolute nightmare. The processes which we are using to get things done, the processes which we are doing to make decisions, situations where minor decisions about people traveling from one place to another have to go to cabinet for a cabinet decision makes absolutely no sense. So whether it is you want to procure a ferry or whether it is you want the Chief Justice to go to some conference, goes to cabinet. So how does business function in that kind of situation? Well, the answer is that business has tremendous difficulty in dealing with that kind of situation. And as you pointed out, if competitiveness is about firms competing, it is firms that compete, not governments. Governments create an enabling environment that enables people to be productive, that enables firms to be productive. And if the government is creating an environment which is choking and blocking and so on, then we are going to be where we are. And the other one I want to make that is that we have to stop comparing ourselves to Latin America. I want us to compare ourselves to Singapore, to Norway, to the United Kingdom, and so on. We have to set a standard. We want to be in the first column of that sheet, not in the second or in the third column. And so therefore, we have to set a standard for ourselves and aspire to that.
Yeah. And interestingly, when we were in stage 3, we were compared to those the larger countries. And what I did last year, I didn't do this year, was that if I take the same web and I impose it against the more developed countries, you'll see that we only would score better than I think maybe 2 of the pillars. So we will be worse in 10 when compared to the best countries in the world.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, let me bring in our guest from Norway. Having heard what would you say are some of the lessons that you would bring from Norway in terms of, recommendation, advice for us here, based on what we have
Yeah.
seen today?
Thank you, and thank you for being here. It's very interesting. This is a society that I do not know very well. I've been here only 2 days. But I know my own country, which is in north of Europe. But there are many similarities to our societies because we also have an economy depending a lot on the oil and gas sector. It's all offshore activity, the oil and gas sector, and we have also been affected by the decline of the prices as you have. And we are looking for other ways to be, innovation is a very, very hot topic in Norway. We are a little country with 5.3 million people, whereas here you are 1.3. And just a comment to Mr. Farrell. You said you want Trinidad Tobago to compare with other states like Singapore and Norway and so on. So I must admit that the first thing I look upon is, are we better than Sweden? We are not. So back to your question, we are behind Sweden. Sweden is our neighbor country, and we're always behind, in the corruption perception index. It's so annoying. And I always get this question, why are we always behind, from journalists, why are we behind Sweden and Denmark? And I don't really have any good answer to that. I mean, it's just a minor little slight 0.1, it's like that, but still behind. And also in this index. So I said, yeah, we depend very much on the oil and gas sector, which has been very, very important since my whole life, actually. Since the beginning of the 70s, we started to earn money from that sector, and in fact, Norway has been an economic sort of adventure. At that time, when we discovered the oil, we had very wise politicians. We still have wise politicians, not to put a shame on anyone, but it was really decided that the wealth from the North Sea should benefit the society as a whole. It was even written down in the act regulating. It was the first paragraph in the act, and that has really happened. We have been able to provide a very good educational system, which is free of charge. And just a small anecdote, when my father went to university, he was the first in his family ever to go to university in the 50s. There were only 3% of the population going to higher education. When I went to university at the end of the 80s, 30%. So you can imagine the growth, and also the healthcare system and all the revenues, most of the revenues are funneled into this pension fund that was mentioned, and which is the world's largest pension fund now, and investing in
Sovereign wealth funds.
Yeah, sovereign wealth funds. Yeah. So this was a very long answer to your question. I already forgotten what your question was, but we are well known for having good institutions. Quite efficient, very low level of corruption. I think this is something that you really, really need to work on, because this was the third, this was the third problematic thing ranked in this index. So I'm actually here to contribute on the anti-corruption conference of Transparency International Trinidad Tobago that takes place tomorrow at Hilton, a one-day conference. I think there will be places left if someone is interested. I think this is something that you really need to take very, very seriously.
You know, Dr. Farrell, I may quote you, and this is a video I always show my class. It's a TED Talk that you did.
All right.
And in it you said, you know, Trinidad and Tobago has been in oil and gas for the last 100 years.
That's right.
And our well sovereign fund is like about
5 billion, yes.
And
Norway started producing oil in the 1970s, started the sovereign wealth fund in the 1990s, and they have reached almost $1 trillion US dollars.
It's huge.
So tell us,
Huge.
what is the secret?
So, she said smart politicians. That's what it is.
No,
I mean, one of the things that is just one thing that I did. If you look at what happened when oil prices fell between 2014 and 2015, and you compare Norway's response to that situation and ours, you will see exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes.
If you look and you read the reports of the Central Bank of Norway in terms of how they analyzed the situation and how they then responded as a society in terms of actually moving the exchange rate, the krona has moved. They've allowed it to depreciate, and they are a far wealthier country than we are, far more diversified than we are. You've just done a huge wind farm offshore Scotland, so they've moved into renewables and so on. And we have sat here for the last 2 years, as Lloyd Best would say, chingsing.
No.
Yes, we are.
So Ian,
Yes.
let's take it to somewhere that you said that you want to leave for later. Diversification.
Sure. And diversification and, in my opinion, innovation are inextricably linked. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about a small open economy, commodity-based, 1.3 million people, fairly well educated, and look at the reasons why that's our second worst item on our ranking, 102, which is innovation. And let's redefine what innovation is, I think, in this category. Because we've been talking about diversification. Everybody here has been hearing about diversification for a very long time. Because that is an obvious act that we have to take forward, right? And you heard Dr. Farrell mention that Norway is into renewables. A country that's into carbon-based energy is looking at renewables as a revenue source in the future. Suriname is looking at their hydroelectric capabilities. Why? Because they're saying we'll use hydroelectric for ourselves and we'll export the oil and gas. So it's obvious not just to us, it's obvious to everyone. We see innovation as something spectacular, as something that, okay, you know, we invented the steel pan, that's innovation. We have all different things. We're very creative people. I think no one here, especially those who probably pursue corrupt activities, are probably some of the most creative people in the country. However, I believe innovation, sustained innovation, is a process. It's not a one-off. It's something that happens in everything that you do. And it starts not just with one or two people inventing the G-Pan or whatever. It starts with people looking at the way you do things and trying to do it better. So the first way you innovate is in what you're good at and make it a competitive advantage, whether relative or absolute, serious competitive advantage. Once you master how you innovate within what you do well, you can start applying that to other areas of activity. And that's really what I believe is missing in our step towards diversification. Because you don't just diversify by guessing which way the wind is blowing, or what's hot out there in the market, or let's go and build, you know, a big, I don't know, technology center, stuff that nobody's using. You have to start diversification, starting with what you are good at. As Wendell Motley told me when I joined Unit Trust Corporation, back to basics. We do what we do well, and we do it the best that anyone else does it, and then come and tell me about what else you want to do. And that's what I don't think we've really done that. We haven't stuck to a plan. We haven't done innovation or diversification through innovating in what we're good at and building that capacity and our capability. So even when we look at, how we invested our education funds, we went as well to, free education and tertiary education and so on. We now have to pull back a little bit. But when you look at what people were studying, there were people coming out with gate-funded education that you could not use in Trinidad and Tobago. So they're now using it elsewhere. And we have to think about how Singapore did it. And I was in a presentation in 1996 at the Crown, but now it's Holiday in the Crown Plaza or whatever, when we had people from Singapore speaking to our graduates. And they were actually telling us how they align their education programs with the shipbuilding, port, logistics, administrative sector. I wasn't actually in the room. I was at the back of the room. I was bringing a document for my boss to sign, and I had to wait to the back of the room until he was ready to sign it. But I was able to listen to this presentation, and that's what they were saying. This is 1996, 20 years ago. So it's not that we don't know what we're supposed to do. The question is, did we have the political will, the strength in academia, and the general societal openness to do what needs to be done? All I can say from Norway, 5.3 million people, oil and gas based, cold as heck. And they still had time, outside the winter months, to actually diversify the economy, build the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, and can actually tell us about anti-corruption.
Taking up on that, what I think we need to do to diversify that we're not doing?
I think we must be creative, yes, but we need to do it in a strategic manner, as Mr. Chinapu said.
Yeah.
So we need to align our creativity with a broad strategic long-term development plan as to which sectors we would like to see developed and allocate resources accordingly. And in that way, I think diversification can be sustained. And, another issue I think we really need to deal with in terms of this whole diversification thrust is, again, from the Competitiveness Report, where we see that the labor force and productivity is an issue. Now, if we look at the data, actually, productivity continues to fall. The most recent data shows a fall in productivity. And until we can fix that problem, diversification, to me, would not, it would not bear fruit.
How do we fix it?
I think, again, it's a culture.
It's policy.
And it's policy-driven, again.
I mean, should we talk about culture a little bit better?
Yeah,
Yes,
of course.
that is
was
a
the next
big,
place I was
yeah.
going.
Yeah, I mean, wow. When we talk about culture, we're talking about group behavior, right? Societal behavior. And in my opinion, part of our challenge is that most individuals I have met in Trinidad and Tobago are actually smarter than us as a whole. They make more intelligent decisions for themselves than when we are sitting down in a group. And that's something that I can't seem to understand because you have the group wisdom there. And when you look at how we've made the decisions and how many people you can speak to, and they will tell you all the right things we should have done and all the things that we can do, you wonder why we haven't done it. So there has to be something implicit in the way we think and behave that drive us to suboptimize, to be less than we can be. And let's talk about back to how we spend. That was a cultural point. The choices we make, knowing that the road ahead is tough, we still find the hardest way to get there. And that's something that's implicit in our behavior. But how can culture be changed? Most people argue that culture change can only take place over a 30-year period, a generation. That's too long for us.
Too long for us.
We won't have our own culture by that time if we continue. So the culture of corruption, the institutional failings that we have, and I think you also mentioned from Norway, you have strong institutions. You all heard that, right? I didn't imagine that. I was not dreaming. the institution, and you heard Dr. Farrell speak about how things have to go through the bureaucracy and so on. That has been such an ingrained part of our culture, inefficiency, finding the hardest way to do something. I think there has to be, at this point, by the way, a very conscious decision as to what, and Dr. Farrell said it, compare ourselves to the best. What are the key success factors in all of these major things that we do? Take the top 10. Who is doing it? Let's bring them in, or let's go to them and say, this is what it's going not to be perfect, but it has to be much better than what we have now. So we have to say, who is best in class on these top things that we are not doing well? And get them in here, or send our people out to learn and just make a quantum leap and say, we are not doing it our way, it hasn't worked. Let's adopt their way and figure it out from there. That's the only solution I can think of at this point to do it.
And I think we can start that right now.
Yeah,
Because
right
I could
now.
ask Ms. Steinmark, what have you done in Norway to assist and to keep corruption fairly insignificant?
Yeah, well, I can speak for what we have done in Transparency International Norway, where I have served as Secretary General since 2009. Because we have also identified some, what can I say, weaker sectors. And what we have done is exactly what you are saying. We have invited them to cooperate with us. We are just a very tiny little organization, but if you ask the sector, could we agree on a common goal? We want this sector to be free of corruption. And everybody would nod, everybody would agree. And then to start to talk, what are the challenges? What can we learn from one another? And how do we go about it? And this particular sector I'm talking about is the municipal sector in Norway. We have like more than 400 municipalities
As
in
local
Norway.
government.
And that's a lot. You know, the smallest one is counting just 300 people or something, you know. They're trying to do something about that structure as well, to create bigger entities. Yeah, but you know, yeah, I'm not going to discuss that now. But we have identified some weaker sectors, and we would invite them to work with us, and you know, we just start with a few municipalities that, yeah, well, we volunteer, we think this is a brilliant idea, and then other people will follow suit, you know, because they see that there are actually improvements, and this is a way to take your time and to discuss what is the problem of nepotism, what is the problem of conflict of interest in procurement processes, and how can we deal with it. And so together we have created an anti-corruption handbook for the municipal sector, and this is why I mentioned this, is that we know that no society is free of corruption. We know that. All societies are affected by corruption. Also in Norway we are affected by corruption. But maybe we have, you know, we have other terms, we use other terms, favoritism, nepotism, and, you know, corruption is a very, is sort of taboo. Do you need to talk about corruption? Do you invite people to talk about corruption? No. You invite people to talk about problems, conflicts of interest, you know, these things I just mentioned. So from my experience, being the head of TI Norway, you know, to invite strategic stakeholders and who can create a very, you know, fruitful and interesting environment, and to make sure that the you know, but I would also like to mention one thing that hasn't been mentioned here at all, and that is the underlying factor not measured here, not measured in many indexes, but that is the level of trust. The level of trust in a society. In Norway, we have, maybe it's sometimes a little bit, we are regarded as a little bit naive, but in fact we have a very, very high level of trust. We trust our politicians, we trust, you're laughing. You know, we trust the parliamentarians, we trust the media. So this is, and why do I say this? Because it lowered sort of the transaction costs. You know, we don't need a contract of hundreds and hundreds of pages. No, maybe we just need a one-pager. You know, I have this experience with signing contracts with Americans. And they're so detailed, you know, what happens if, you know, the will of God, something. And I look at it and can we just simplify? We trust one another. We're doing it in agreement. We want to, you know, for the benefit of, for the mutual benefit of the partners.
Well, yeah, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the data is very clear in terms of high trust societies and low trust societies in terms of development. If you look at the World Values Survey, I think it confirms that. It confirms that Trinidad Tobago is a low trust society and places like Norway high trust societies. I just want to come back very quickly to the innovation point.
Yes.
And just to say that, again here, when the Economic Development Advisory Board started working 2 years ago, we encountered that the previous Minister of Planning and Development, Mr. Tiwari, had in fact done a draft national innovation policy which had gone to cabinet in 2014. We took that document, we didn't throw it away, we took that document, we revised that document, and we produced another version of the draft innovation policy. We made it, what we put forward is that we put forward certain implementation mechanisms inside there which was not part of the original document. That was done back in June of this year. That, I think, Dr. Logjak was part of that process. I see Mr. Thiessen here from the European Union. They were part of that process as well. That policy document is still somewhere in the public service cyberspace. I don't know, I don't know where it is. And to the point, you see, innovation is something that is done by people in the private sector, people out at universities and so on. But again, it is a classic situation where the government has to provide an enabling environment for innovation to take place. And so what we had proposed is that we proposed a national innovation agency that would have within it all of the elements that would support private sector innovation. And importantly, in that innovation agency would be funded on a sustainable basis. See, one of the problems that we've had here with our institutions is that we will create an institution, the government will invent an institution, they will put it into place, and then after 2 years, they don't fund it. They will give it a budget 2 million 1 year, and the next year, the budget they get 1 million, and the next year they get 5, depending on who. And you can't carry out your mission successfully. And if you look around, we see all of these institutions that we have, and they are not functioning, as Havelock Wooster told us back in 1974. Institutions flourish, but they do not function. You have to fund something like that on a sustainable basis, otherwise it is going to fall down and fail. And one of the things that we recommended very early in the government is that, look, if you are going to fund diversification and to fund innovation, we do have the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Separate these into 2 funds, the Stabilization Fund, which the Minister of Finance can use, and the Heritage Fund, which we can then take and use the interest or part of the earnings from that to support things like innovation, to support certain of our diversification trusts and so on a sustainable basis. As I said, when I look at the problems that we have in terms of the public service and where these things are, how they work and so on, I am concerned, quite frankly, that all these months have passed and, quite frankly, nothing has happened.
And Balraj, I just want to share something on culture. 5 categories of culture. You have toxic to generative. innovation flourishes in a generative culture. Just very quickly, a toxic culture is one that's focused on doing only for yourself against everyone else. A dysfunctional culture is the next one. And that's where you scratch my back, I scratch yours. That might sound somewhat familiar. Compliant cultures are just about following your process and doing what you're supposed to do. Then you get to the positive one, sustainable. This is where you work to help others as you would want them to help you. And then generative, which is working for all. And what our friend from Norway, which is your name? Guru, said is that in there, when they discovered the oil of North Sea, the first paragraph said, this should benefit all. You remember that? In that culture, which is generative, is where you get things like evoking genius, co-creative, mutually nourishing. And that's where innovation flourishes. So part of the reason we can't get it out of the system is because the culture we have is not built around doing things for everyone. It's about taking care of myself first. And that's something we need to deal with in order for all of this to really make sense. And that's science, that's there, and it's in black and white. So we need to ask ourselves, what type of culture do we want, and what do we expect to get? Because if you expect to get innovation or innovative behaviors in a culture that's dysfunctional or toxic, it simply cannot happen.
So how do we move that?
Exactly, and there is a process to move that. And it starts with, back to the trust factor, right? Getting people who others can trust and having them make decisions in the best interest of more than themselves or their particular sector or their particular interest groups. So we need to have that type of conversation as to who are those people, where do they reside, and how can they come to the national forefront. And at the end of the day, our politics is driven by an election. So you come back to people thinking, well, I'm going to elect somebody who can do the best for me, get my family a job, whatever the case may be. Are we able as a society to see where that road will take us and make a decision otherwise? So, honestly, I know you talk about the government and institutions. I think it comes right back to society. It's really not the people who we put there, because we put them there using a failed premise of what we put them there for. We have to put them there for the right reason, and then you'll get the trust. Then you'll get the ability to honor people who or make decisions for all and not for me or my group.
Does that then mean we need political reform?
Political reform. I come back to the whole question of leadership. We need to have people, leaders in the government, in business, in the trade union sector, and so on, who are prepared to step up and who are prepared to take really difficult decisions, who need to kind of step out of the culture, so to speak, that we've been born into and are accustomed acting in. And unfortunately, I think that we're not seeing that kind of leadership emerging. And I'm saying it is government has a problem, public service has a problem, I'm saying the private sector also has a problem. Innovation, let's go back to the question of innovation. The private sector needs to relate to the universities, it needs to relate to the government in terms of getting innovation done. Our private sector tends not to do that. Our private sector tends to look for solutions outside of the country almost automatically, almost instinctively. And therefore, to get that collaboration that you need between the triple helix between government, university, and the private sector is something which requires each one of those parties. The university people tend to remain in their sort of ivory tower. They don't talk to the people downtown. They have no intercourse people in the private sector. They don't know the private sector leaders, what their problems are. So we need to foster that. And what we saw is that if you had a national innovation agency, which became a kind of a common space for government, private sector, and the university to collaborate, to interact on the basis of trust. Because see, one of the concerns that the private sector would have is that if I develop something, and I as the government are now coming in to help you, for example, to say, well, let's see what the intellectual property protection you might need for this innovation, people are suspicious about that because they don't trust the government. They will feel that that government official is going to take their idea and give it to their friend or to their family. So what we really do have to work on creating that kind of space, putting people who lead these organizations, that people could look at these people, they could repose some trust in those people, and trust is something which comes from interaction and engagement over a period of time, where the outcomes tend to be favorable. So that is something, it's a process that you have, and societies build that over time. Trinidad Tobago has become a very deeply divided, almost polarized society, but we can't continue like that. We do have to create these common spaces, and we have to begin the process of building, engaging with each other, and building that trust.
Dr. Kisto, just to add to that as well, I mean, the private sector, I think, has a very important part to play. A good example of this is actually, just a shameless plug, but actually during the period May to August of this year, First Citizens actually partnered with the University of the West Indies, with the computer science department. We actually had interns coming into the bank as part of the group, working on real life problems within the bank and coming up with their own solutions to that. And I think in that way, that is how the private sector should really embrace the knowledge that is contained within the universities and that academia.
Absolutely.
I can share something, I just came back from Jamaica and I visited a large financial group. And I'm, doing business there and I'm walking around and they say, let's take you to our center. I don't want to sell them out. And in this center, they have a mini Silicon Valley. They're building 12, but they have 3 innovation labs in progress with people from outside, within the company, within the country. And they are working on technology solutions for a host of issues. So this is actually with metrics and weekly reports and beanbags and snacks, and it's essentially, I was not expecting to see that level of innovative thinking, even anywhere in the Caribbean. So I thought I was transported to Silicon Valley for a minute. So this is happening, but it's not happening here. And this is Jamaica. So I'm just saying, this is a private institution in Jamaica funding something that would be for the national good. Innovative.
Again, it comes back to the function of institutions, and we see Jamaica being able to do that. As we draw to the quick closing comments, and I want you to focus on the budget. What would you like to see there?
What I like to see in the budget, I think I'll go back to my first comment. I'd like to see hard thinking about what we need versus what we want. How's that? I'd like to see some hard thinking around that. Spending on what we need versus what we want. And what we need for the present as well as for long-term development of the country. So let's focus on investing in things like public-private partnerships. Let's focus on developing things that will improve our efficiency, training and development, not only in areas that would pertain to your specific job, but in how to think about, in the public service, for example, how do we empower public servants to come up with better solutions and not just tell them, follow from 1 to 5. So looking down the road, let's look at investment in, I love Dr. Farrell's idea. Let's separate the Heritage and Stabilization Fund and use the heritage part of it, the income from that, to plan for our future while we use our current income to deal with our challenges now. So, I fully support and endorse those types of initiatives.
Okay, well, the budget this year, I think the expectation really is for it to continue in the last few years in the tune, in a bid to sort of rebalance public financing. I think divestment and / privatization might be an option as well. Contingent liabilities, which is the debt of all these state agencies in Trinidad, is very high as a % of GDP. So I think we need to really relook or restructure the state enterprises that we have right now, because we already have constrained revenue stream. I think the implementation of the capital expenditure program as well, I think that is very important to sustain growth going forward as well. But all that has to be done within the context of a medium-term fiscal strategy in order to eventually bring the deficit or to balance the budget in the medium term.
Dr. Farrell?
I don't comment on the budget.
You don't, but let me ask you, I'm glad you don't comment on the budget. Let me ask you the question differently. Now that you have been interfacing with the public service, what are some of the things you would do there to ease your frustration?
Well, no, the public service, that's another whole conversation. The public service that we're operating.
bureaucracy.
Yes, the bureaucracy that we're operating. And bureaucracy is not a bad word. Every country needs a bureaucracy. But the bureaucracy that we've been operating was put in place in the 1950s by the colonial authorities. That's the structure that we are operating today in 2017. It has to change. The Public Service Commissions is a colonial institution that was started by the colonial authorities in 1951. We inherited it, put it into our constitution, our Public Service Commission, Judicial and Legal Service Commission, all the bacchanal that we're having now and the problems with these three-part matters is as a result of a set of institutions which have been there from before independence, which we have not changed. And we have to change them. And I think that we can't simply say that because you need a special majority in the parliament to change it, and I'm not going to get a special majority, therefore we will do nothing. Because if we don't do something, if we can't persuade the opposition, who may become the government and confront the same problems in 5 years' time, then quite frankly, we are going to continue to experience the same sets of issues with a public service which is degenerating. We look at the problem of contract workers in the public service, causing, we developed that as a solution to a problem, and now the contract workers in the public service have now become the problem. We simply can't go on that way. The service commissions have to be reformed. They have to be taken out of the Constitution, in my view, and set up as human resource departments, as they have been done in New Zealand, in Australia, and every other country, that you put them as a human resource department. And we have to stop this thing about a career public service, where people come into the public service at age 18 and retire at age 60. We have to stop that. We have to bring people in. I should be able to bring somebody, I should be able to bring Van Tobago in as a permanent secretary in a ministry, and give her a contract for 5 years, as they do in New Zealand, and allow her to run the ministry. What we have done instead is that we have this career public service progression, and let me tell you something. Over the course of the last several years, we have a lot of people who have come up the public service through the HR stream and who end up as permanent secretaries, and they are not subject matter specialists. Somebody could become a permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance who is not an economist or an accountant. They're an HR professional. And they tell you, I don't need to be a subject matter specialist to be permanent secretary. Well, that is nonsense. You can't be permanent secretary in the Ministry of Energy and not be. So there are some fundamental reforms that need to take place in the public service. We have been advocating for some of these things. They do need to have constitutional reform to get them done, but quite frankly, they need to get that done.
You know, taking off on that point, one of the things we need to have here is more trust, more collaboration. How have you been able to achieve that? In closing statement, what are some of the advice you can give us to improve that trust and create that sort of synergy?
Difficult question. Trust is something that you build, millimeter by millimeter, very, very slowly. But the thing about this trust is it's also very vulnerable. So it can be teared down in meters. So we need to be aware of that. But let me just go back, because you know that Norway used to be a poor country, one of the poorest countries in Europe. And we had a lot of immigration to the States. And my grandfather, he emigrated. He fortunately came back and were able to buy the farm. This is very long ago. And then we were occupied by the Germans during the Second World War, which was terrible for 5 years, terrible period for Norway. And I think after all this, suffering, and we had these politicians that they really, really wanted to build the country. That was number one, build the country after the Second World War. And that was so important, all people to work. This is sort of an attitude that we were so lucky to have these politicians. They saw people and they saw their suffering, and they really were concerned about building a welfare state. And so this was also the attitude when we discovered the oil. And now there is no political argument about that, because we have seen the good results of it all. So it's difficult. It's a mixture of many factors. It's you may say that we are born with trust. We trust our parents. You know, we grow up. We trust our teacher. We have trust in. And where does it happen that we lose that trust? What happens? Where in the? This is a very sort of more or less philosophical question, and there is also a question: how do we? What comes first, the welfare state or trust? You know, there has been some studies around these issues as well. Very interesting, but you know, you can also create. We had a former chair of the International TI Board, Huguette Labelle. She's coming tomorrow for the conference, by the way. And she has this beautiful notion. She says, islands of integrity. You know, you can work in rough environments, but you can decide that, for instance, this sector, this branch, this business is, we just decide it's going to be corruption-free. You know? Even if it's hard and even if it's, so you can create an island of integrity. I love that notion.
Thank you. So, with that, I would like to thank members of the panels. Let's give them a few rounds of applause.
Panel, our ranking. This brings us to our closing proceedings. And ladies and gentlemen, our ranking this year, as you see, we've improved. We want to remain in that.